After my husband's affair with my best friend, I lost everything. My job, my home, and even my sense of worth. He told me I would never recover. While living in a shabby motel, I discovered an old dusty suitcase with my name on it. Inside were $100,000 in cash, a flight ticket, and a handwritten note. This is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. When I arrived, what I found changed my life completely. 7 months earlier, I'd had a husband, a stable job, and a best friend I trusted with my life. Now I was living in a motel that charged by the week, eating cheap meals that cost less than $2, and trying to survive on freelance work that barely covered rent. My husband, Eric, had been sleeping with my best friend, Amber. When I discovered their affair, my entire world collapsed so quickly it almost felt planned. Within 2 weeks, I lost my job and the divorce left me with nearly nothing. My friends stopped answering my calls. I went from middle-class stability to rock bottom in less than 2 months. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and sharing this journey with me. If you believe in truth, courage, and second chances, please subscribe. It's free and helps these stories reach others who need hope. And also tell us which city you're from. It's important for us to know how far our stories reach. Now let's see what happened next. One night, I was sitting on the edge of the bed that squeaked every time I moved, eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, when I noticed a suitcase under the bed. It was made of old brown leather with brass corners and had a luggage tag with my full name written in the familiar handwriting of my Aunt Margaret. She had died 9 months earlier, the eccentric family member everyone had called difficult and paranoid. I pulled the suitcase out, found a small key taped to the bottom, and unlocked it. Inside were $100,000 in cash and a note that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. The note warned me not to trust Eric or Amber, revealed that they had been plotting against me since before my wedding, and said that my mother's death 6 years earlier had not been an accident. The message directed me to an address in Denver, where the real fortune was waiting. It ended with a command to finish what my mother had started before they silenced her. Aunt Margaret had spent her last years collecting evidence while everyone called her crazy. Now she was giving me a choice. Take the money and disappear, or use it to fight back against those who destroyed my life. I'm Megan Lawson, and before everything fell apart, my life looked perfectly ordinary. I had a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood where people still greeted each other by name. Mrs. Harper, the elderly woman down the hall, always smiled when she saw me. The maintenance guy actually showed up when something broke. The apartment wasn't fancy. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television at night, and the carpet still showed stains from previous tenants no matter how hard I scrubbed. But Eric and I had painted the living room together, spent a Saturday building furniture from flat-pack boxes, and hung wedding photos on the wall where the afternoon light made everything feel warmer than it really was. I worked as a marketing coordinator at Harris & Partners Marketing, a mid-sized firm downtown that handled campaigns for small local businesses, social media strategies for restaurants, website redesigns for dental offices, and email marketing for tiny boutiques barely able to afford our services. It wasn't the career I'd dreamed of when I graduated college, hoping to work with big brands, but it paid $50,000 a year with benefits. That was enough to cover my share of the rent and groceries and still leave a little for the occasional dinner out when Eric and I wanted to pretend we had more money than we actually did. My boss, Philip Harris, was professional but distant, the kind of supervisor who praised your work in meetings but never promoted you. He'd ask about your weekend but never listened to the answer. I'd worked there for years, earning performance reviews full of compliments that never turned into raises or advancement. But I didn't question it. Every morning I arrived at 8:30, made coffee in the sputtering office machine, sat at my desk overlooking the parking lot, and did my job. It felt safe and predictable. Eric worked as a business consultant, or at least that's what he told me. His schedule was irregular in ways that seemed normal for someone in his field. He often stayed up late finishing proposals, took weekend trips to meet startup founders in Phoenix or Dallas, and joined conference calls at odd hours with East Coast clients. He'd come home exhausted, kiss my forehead, heat up leftovers from the fridge, and fall asleep on the couch with his laptop still open. I'd cover him with a blanket and feel a strange mix of affection and loneliness, proud that he worked so hard, yet frustrated by how little time we actually spent together. We'd met 7 years earlier at a dinner party hosted by mutual friends. Or so I'd believed. Eric had been charming that night. He asked about my work and genuinely listened. He cracked clever jokes without being mean. He helped clean up after dinner when everyone else relaxed in the living room. At the end of the evening he asked for my number and I gave it to him, trying not to seem too eager. Our relationship felt natural, like we were meant to be together. Dinners at cozy restaurants, walks through the city, lazy Sunday mornings spent reading the paper in bed. After 18 months he proposed, on one knee in the same park where we'd had our third date. I said yes instantly because I couldn't imagine a reason to say no. But over the last 2 years things had begun to change. Subtle shifts I noticed but tried to rationalize. Eric became more protective of his phone, tilting the screen away when I passed by, taking calls in another room, setting it face down during dinner. He became vague about his work, offering general answers instead of the detailed stories he used to share. He picked fights over small things. The way I loaded the dishwasher, whether we needed organic vegetables, how much time I spent talking to Amber. Amber had been my best friend since college, back when we were broke students splitting packets of ramen and talking about the future. She'd been my maid of honor, standing beside me in the dress we'd chosen together, crying during the ceremony in a way that made me cry too. She helped us move into our apartment, hauling boxes up 3 flights of stairs and joking about how much stuff we owned. Every Thursday for the past 5 years she came over with a bottle of wine and we'd sit on my couch talking about everything. Her dating disasters, my work frustrations, my growing worry that Eric and I were drifting apart. She listened with empathy, nodding at all the right times and saying, "All marriages go through phases. You two just need to reconnect." She told me how lucky I was to have someone like Eric, how most men weren't as supportive or steady, and how I shouldn't take him for granted. I believed her. Because doubting your best friend feels like doubting reality itself. If you can't trust the person who's been beside you for over a decade, who can you trust? My mother, Evelyn, had died 6 years earlier in a car accident on a rainy night. Her car had wrapped around a tree on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. The police said she was speeding or had fallen asleep at the wheel. My Aunt Margaret, her older sister, insisted something about the story didn't add up. But everyone dismissed her concerns as grief. Aunt Margaret had always been the difficult one. The family member who arrived at gatherings handing out pamphlets about corporate corruption and warning us not to trust the wrong people. When Aunt Margaret passed away 9 months earlier, she had been completely alone in her house, surrounded by filing cabinets stacked to the ceiling and old newspapers that filled every corner. The sight of that cluttered, silent home stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about her final moments, the loneliness that must have filled those rooms. I felt a heavy, aching guilt for not visiting her more often, for not taking her warnings seriously, for brushing her off as paranoid when maybe she had simply noticed the patterns that the rest of us were too comfortable, or too afraid, to see. At that time I believed my life was in perfect order. Every morning I went to work, paid my bills on time, kept the apartment spotless, and tried to be the kind of wife everyone would describe as dependable. I followed the unwritten rules of middle-class respectability as if they were a guarantee against disaster. I truly believed that if I worked hard enough, trusted the right people, and played by the rules, I would be safe from the kind of chaos that happened to other people. I convinced myself that doing everything right mattered, that loyalty meant something, that integrity would be rewarded. I thought the life I had built was real, solid, and mine. But sitting here now in this rundown motel room with its cigarette-stained walls and a bed that squeaks with every movement, I can see how naive that belief was. Everything I had once trusted, my job, my marriage, even my friendships, had been carefully constructed by people who saw me as convenient, as useful, rather than human. Every relationship I thought was built on trust had been nothing more than a performance. My marriage, my work, my friendships. All of it had been part of an elaborate act meant to keep me obedient and unsuspecting. The apartment where I felt safe, the office that seemed stable, the people I believed loved me. None of it had been real. Every part of my life had rested on foundations that were hollow from the start. But at the time I didn't know that. 7 months earlier I was still living in what I thought was my normal, secure life. I was convinced that routine meant safety, that the rules I followed were written by people who actually obeyed them. I didn't know that Eric and Amber had been planning my destruction since before our wedding. I didn't know that my mother's death hadn't been an accident. I didn't know that Aunt Margaret had spent her final years collecting evidence that everyone around her dismissed as nonsense. I didn't know any of it until the day I discovered that old suitcase with $100,000 inside and a note that offered me a choice: to disappear and start over, or to fight back against the people who had destroyed everything. By then, I had already lost everything I thought mattered. The suitcase was sitting on the motel bed beside me, the bundles of cash spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Aunt Margaret's letter was still in my hand, the paper soft and fragile from being unfolded and refolded so many times. I read it again and again, trying to make sense of the words that rewrote my entire history. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Your mother's death was no accident. Finish what she started before they silence you too. I stared at those lines until they blurred. I needed to understand how I had missed it all, how I had lived inside a lie for 7 years without ever recognizing the truth. I let myself remember that Tuesday morning 6 months ago, the day my illusions finally shattered beyond repair. That morning I woke up feeling sick, not the kind of nausea that comes from spoiled food or the flu, but a deep unease that sat heavy in my stomach and made every breath feel wrong. I tried to ignore it. I showered, made toast, and took one bite before realizing I couldn't swallow. I told myself it was nothing, that I just needed coffee and to get on with my day. Eric was still asleep when I got dressed for work. He told me the night before that he had a late meeting and needed to rest. By 10 o'clock I was sitting at my desk at Harrison Partners Marketing, staring blankly at a social media calendar for a dental office. My hands felt cold. My heartbeat wouldn't slow down. The nausea only grew stronger. Finally I stood up, walked to Philip Harris's office and told him I needed to go home. I braced for his reaction. He wasn't the kind of boss who liked people leaving in the middle of the day, even if they had good reason. But he just looked at me strangely, his expression unreadable, and said, "Feel better," in a tone that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. It was the tone of someone who already knew something I didn't, someone who was relieved I was leaving. The drive home took about 20 minutes through slow midday traffic. I kept the radio off. Every sound felt too loud, too invasive. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just anxiety, but the sense of dread grew with every block I passed. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of our apartment building, I saw Amber's silver Honda Civic parked in the visitor spot. I had ridden in that car countless times, gone on shopping trips, weekend getaways, coffee runs. She had a key to our apartment and sometimes stopped by during the day if her Wi-Fi wasn't working. Normally that would have been fine. But on a Tuesday afternoon when Eric was supposed to be at the office and Amber was supposed to be working from home, something about it made my stomach twist. I sat there for a full minute with the engine running, staring at her car, trying to reason with myself. Maybe they were working on something together. Maybe Eric had come home early sick and Amber had stopped by to check on him. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation. I repeated those maybes over and over, clinging to them like a life raft. Eventually I turned off the engine, got out and walked across the parking lot. I climbed 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken again, my footsteps echoing against the chipped walls and worn carpet. The hallway light flickered above me. I put my key into the lock as quietly as possible, though I didn't know why I felt the need to be silent. The apartment was quiet, not the kind of silence that means emptiness, but the kind that hums, that makes you aware someone else is there. I stood still in the living room, my work bag still hanging from my shoulder, and listened. That's when I heard it: laughter. Amber's laughter. Not her casual laugh, the one I'd heard 1,000 times when we watched comedies or shared stories. This was softer, more intimate. The kind of laugh meant for someone special. I froze, staring at the closed bedroom door. My mind raced, desperate to find another explanation. Maybe she was on the phone. Maybe Eric wasn't home and she was watching something funny. Maybe I was imagining it. But deep down, beneath every frantic excuse, I knew. I already knew what I would see when I opened that door. I crossed the living room slowly, each step feeling like it took an hour. My hands were shaking. I didn't knock. Why would I knock on my own bedroom door? I turned the handle and pushed it open. Eric and Amber were in my bed, tangled in the gray sheets I had washed 3 days earlier. They looked at each other with the kind of comfort that doesn't form overnight. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was routine. Something they had done often enough to look practiced. When they saw me standing there, the first thing I noticed wasn't guilt. It was annoyance. Amber's face showed irritation, as if I had interrupted something important instead of discovering the worst betrayal of my life. She didn't reach for the sheets. She didn't apologize. She just stared at me with a look that said, "You should have seen this coming." Eric got out of bed and started pulling on his jeans, doing it so quickly and efficiently that it was clear this wasn't his first time getting dressed in a hurry. That realization cut deeper than the sight itself. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't impulsive. It was planned, repeated, familiar. He had done this before. And when he looked at me, the expression on his face wasn't shame or regret. It was something far worse. It was impatience, mixed with a strange kind of relief, as if he'd finally been freed from the burden of pretending. "Megan," he said in that calm, steady tone he always used when he thought I was being irrational. "We need to talk about this like adults. This isn't what it looks like." The absurdity of his words nearly made me laugh. It was exactly what it looked like. Yet there he stood in the middle of our bedroom, caught in the most blatant act of betrayal possible, trying to gaslight me into doubting what I saw with my own eyes, as if I were the one creating a problem by refusing to accept his rewritten version of reality. Amber sat up, holding the sheet around herself with a sense of modesty that would have been comical if it hadn't been so insulting. She had the nerve to look at me with something close to pity. "We didn't want you to find out like this," she said, as though there could ever be a good way to discover that your husband and your best friend were sleeping together. "But honestly, Megan, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The arrogance of that statement knocked the air out of me. It wasn't just that she had been sleeping with Eric. It was the assumption that I should have known, that somehow this was my fault for not seeing it sooner. As if their betrayal was justified because my marriage had flaws I had been too stupid or blind to notice. I asked the one question I knew I'd regret. "How long?" My voice sounded strange, detached, as though I were asking about something meaningless instead of the total collapse of my life. Eric replied in a flat, emotionless tone, like he was discussing a business deal that had simply run its course. "Does it matter? Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest." That word, pretending, cut through me deeper than anything else. How long had he been pretending to love me? How long had every kiss, every embrace, every "I love you" been a lie? How many Thursday nights had Amber sat on my couch, drinking my wine, listening to me talk about my marriage, offering carefully crafted advice meant to keep me compliant, while spending the rest of the week in my husband's bed? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I simply turned around, walked into the living room, and began shoving clothes into a duffel bag I pulled from the hall closet. My laptop, chargers, toiletries, all the practical things a person needs when their life collapses overnight. Eric followed me, still shirtless, still insisting we talk like adults, as though this were a misunderstanding that could be resolved through calm, reasonable discussion. I ignored him, walked out of the apartment I had helped pay for, got into my car and drove to a coffee shop 3 miles away. I parked, sat there and cried until I couldn't breathe. Then I called my cousin Claire and asked if I could stay on her couch for a few days while I figured out what to do next. That was 6 months ago. Now, sitting in this motel room with Aunt Margaret's letter and $100,000 in cash, I understood that Tuesday had been even worse than I'd imagined. The betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been calculated, planned. Part of something much larger. Something that connected to my mother's death and whatever Aunt Margaret had spent her final years investigating. They had been playing a long, deliberate game and my life had been their board. I had been too trusting, too naive, too eager to believe in the safety of normal life to see what was happening, until it was far too late. I had been sleeping on Claire's couch for 5 days when I got the call from Philip Harris. My cousin had been kind enough to let me stay in her guest room, and I had been clinging to normalcy by continuing to go to work every day as if nothing had changed. I told myself that sleeping in someone else's house with all my belongings in a duffel bag was only temporary, not a sign that my entire life had fallen apart. Philip's voice on the phone had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news and want to sound sympathetic. He asked me to come to his office first thing Monday morning. I tried to convince myself it was about a new client or a scheduled performance review, anything routine. I didn't let myself consider the alternative. I arrived at 8:15, wearing clothes I had ironed using Claire's board because I wanted to look professional and composed, even though I felt like I was barely holding myself together. Philip's office door was open when I arrived, and he waved me in with an expression that could have been sympathy or quiet satisfaction disguised behind professionalism. "Megan," he said, motioning toward the chair across from his desk. "I need to talk to you about some changes in the department." I sat down, my hands folded tightly in my lap, doing my best to keep my face neutral. Philip shuffled some papers on his desk without looking directly at me, and I felt my stomach drop even before he spoke. "We're restructuring the marketing department due to budget constraints," he said, using that polished corporate language designed to sound official and impersonal. "Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. We're offering a severance package to help with the transition." He slid a folder across the desk toward me. I didn't touch it. I just stared at him, trying to process the words while my mind screamed that this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after everything else. "Budget constraints?" I repeated, hearing how distant and hollow my voice sounded. "We just signed 3 new clients last month. I've seen the reports. We're not struggling financially." Philip's expression didn't change. "These decisions are made above my level, Megan. I'm sorry, but the decision is final." I wanted to ask if Eric had anything to do with this. Maybe Philip had heard about the separation and decided I was a liability. But the flicker of discomfort in his eyes told me not to ask. The answer wouldn't help me. It would only make the humiliation worse. I took the folder, walked out of his office, and packed my desk in 20 minutes. No one made eye contact with me. My co-workers suddenly became absorbed in their screens or found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. By 9 o'clock, I was walking out of Harrison Partners Marketing with a cardboard box that held 4 years of my professional life and a severance package barely enough to cover 2 months of rent. Later, much later, I would learn that Philip and Eric had been college roommates. Their connection had always been part of the design of my life, woven into it without my knowledge. My job had never been as secure as I'd believed. It had always depended on my usefulness to people whose motives I didn't understand. But that morning, sitting in my car in the parking lot with my box of things beside me, I only felt the ground shift again. Another foundation giving way beneath my feet before I had even recovered from the first collapse. 2 weeks later, the divorce proceedings began. Eric hired Victoria Crane, a ruthless attorney known for winning through procedural manipulation and strategic cruelty. My attorney was court-appointed, a weary man named Leonard Brooks who looked like he'd stopped believing in justice years ago and was just marking time until retirement. Victoria filed motions that painted me as unstable, irresponsible, even dangerous. She used the fact that I had lost my job as proof that I was incapable of managing my own life. She used my temporary housing situation, the fact that I was sleeping on my cousin's couch, as evidence that I couldn't handle my own life. Every single detail of my circumstances was turned into ammunition in a legal strategy meant to prove that Eric deserved to keep everything while I deserved nothing. The judge overseeing our case was Thomas Whitmore, a man in his late 50s who moved through his docket with such efficiency it felt like he had already made up his mind before hearing any testimony. Every motion Victoria filed, he approved. Every request Leonard made on my behalf, he denied without even glancing at the supporting documents. Eric kept our apartment because his name appeared first on the mortgage. Even though I had contributed equally to the down payment and the monthly payments for 5 years, he kept our car because I had missed 2 payments during the chaos that followed losing my job. He kept the furniture we had bought together, the savings account we had built together, and the retirement funds I had spent years contributing to. The settlement left me with my clothes, my laptop, and barely enough money to cover 3 months' rent in the cheapest apartment I could find. The worst part wasn't losing material things or even the financial ruin. It was watching Amber take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore a navy blue designer suit I recognized instantly. We had picked it out together 2 years earlier during a shopping trip where we spent an entire afternoon trying on clothes and laughing in dressing rooms. She had asked what I thought about that exact suit, and I'd told her it made her look confident and professional. Now she was wearing it to testify against me in divorce court. She sat in the witness chair with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and lied with the kind of confidence that comes only from practice. She told Judge Whitmore that I had been unstable for months, that I had made alarming comments about hurting myself, that I had become paranoid and hard to be around, and that Eric had stayed in the marriage out of obligation and fear rather than love. None of it was true, not a single word. But Amber delivered each lie with perfect emotional precision. Her voice cracked just slightly in all the right moments. Her face carried a look of concern mixed with reluctance, as though testifying against me was painful but necessary for my own good. Judge Whitmore listened with what looked like concern, nodding along and taking notes. When Leonard tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Eric, Victoria objected before he could even finish his question. The judge sustained it right away, cutting off any chance to show when the affair had actually started or that Amber's testimony might have come from motives other than concern for me. I sat at the defense table watching my best friend of more than a decade systematically destroy what was left of my credibility. And that was when I realized, this had all been planned. The affair, the job loss, the divorce proceedings, every piece of it had been timed and executed with precision far too exact to be coincidence. After the divorce was finalized, Claire let me stay in her guest room for 3 weeks before her husband, Ryan, began making pointed comments about how I needed to get my life together. He never said it directly to me, but I heard him talking to Claire in their bedroom at night, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "She can't stay here forever," he said. "You're not helping her by letting her avoid dealing with her situation. She needs to find her own place and start rebuilding instead of hiding here." Claire defended me in a weary voice that suggested she was running out of patience. "She's going through a hard time," she said. "She just needs a little more support before she can get back on her feet." But even as she spoke, I could hear the doubt creeping into her tone. The exhaustion of dealing with someone else's crisis was wearing her down. I started looking for somewhere else to go before Claire had to ask me to leave, and we both had to pretend it wasn't awkward. My former coworker, Melissa, offered me her couch for 10 days. Then she decided my presence was bringing negative energy into her apartment and said she needed to focus on her own mental health. A friend from college said I could stay with her for a week, then remembered she had family visiting and needed the guest room. Another friend let me crash on her couch for 5 days before her roommate complained about having a stranger in their living room. Everyone was sympathetic, up until sympathy became inconvenient. Up until supporting me required something more than kind words and short-term gestures. Then suddenly they remembered prior commitments, family obligations, and personal boundaries that meant I had to become someone else's problem. I understood it on some level. No one wants to live with another person's chaos forever. No one wants their home to turn into a shelter for a friend who can't seem to get her life back together. But the speed with which people withdrew their support taught me something about how conditional most relationships really are, how quickly compassion expires once it becomes uncomfortable. When I finally scraped together enough money from freelance social media work to pay for a weekly rate at the Silver Star Motel, it felt less like hitting rock bottom and more like finally standing on something solid again. At least the motel didn't pretend to care. At least Rita at the front desk didn't offer fake comfort or temporary sympathy that would vanish once I became inconvenient. Room 14 at the Silver Star Motel became my address 3 days after the last friend stopped returning my calls. I had scraped together $200 from freelance social media work for a local bakery and a pet grooming business, both of which paid me in irregular installments that arrived weeks after I submitted invoices. The motel sat off Route 41, the kind of place where the weekly rate was advertised in huge numbers while the nightly rate was almost hidden, and where the sign out front had been missing letters for so long that no one even bothered to fix it anymore. The woman at the front desk wore a tag that said Rita and had an expression suggesting she had seen this exact story play out thousands of times. Women arriving alone with duffel bags and desperate eyes, paying by the week while pretending it was temporary. She didn't ask why I was there or how long I planned to stay. She simply took my cash, handed me a key attached to a green plastic tag with the number 14 embossed in faded gold, and recited the rules in a flat tone that sounded like she had repeated them so often they no longer meant anything. Weekly rate includes utilities. Checkout is at 11 if you're leaving. No visitors after 10. Laundry rooms around back. $3 a load. Vending machines take bills or coins. I thanked her, took my duffel bag and carried it across the parking lot to a door that had once been painted blue but had faded into a color that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The key stuck in the lock and I had to jiggle it 3 times before the mechanism finally turned and let me in. The room smelled like decades of cigarette smoke layered under industrial cleaner. 2 cents fighting a battle neither could win. The carpet was brown with a pattern designed to hide stains, which probably meant it was concealing decades worth of them. The bed sagged in the middle like it had given up on supporting anything, even people's hopes. A small table stood near the window with 2 mismatched chairs, and a television from the early 2000s sat on a dresser with drawers that refused to close properly. The bathroom was tiny with a shower stall that had seen better years and a mirror that made everything look slightly yellow. This was home now. This was what my life had become. A room that charged by the week in a motel where no one asked questions because asking questions might mean caring about the answers. I tried to create some kind of routine, something that would keep me from completely falling apart. I woke up early, made a cup of instant coffee using the small machine that came with the room, and spent the mornings applying for jobs online. Marketing coordinator roles, social media manager positions, anything remotely connected to my experience or education. Every week, I sent out dozens of applications, rewriting cover letters and adjusting my resume to match whatever skills each posting emphasized. No one called back. Not a single rejection email came through. My applications just vanished into the digital void companies used to filter through hundreds of desperate candidates. Silence became its own kind of answer. In the afternoons, I worked on whatever freelance projects I could find. Small businesses that needed someone to manage their Facebook page, write email newsletters, or design promotional graphics. The work paid little and came irregularly, but it covered my weekly motel bill with just enough left for food. Dinner was usually instant ramen microwaved in a plastic bowl. Sometimes I'd treat myself to a can of soup or a frozen meal from the convenience store 2 blocks away. I'd sit on the edge of the bed eating while watching television shows I didn't care about, just to have noise that wasn't the sound of my own thoughts. My neighbors stayed mostly invisible. There was a long-haul truck driver named Dale who parked his rig in the far corner of the lot. He'd nod at me sometimes when our paths crossed, but we never spoke. A woman who worked night shifts at the hospital lived a few doors down. Her curtains were always closed and she came and went at strange hours. A man in his 60s occupied the room next to mine. He played country music at a volume just low enough that I couldn't complain, but loud enough that I could hear it through the thin walls. I avoided looking at myself in the bathroom mirror because I didn't recognize the woman staring back. The face was mine, but her eyes had changed. Something inside them was broken and hadn't healed. That hollow, defeated look filled me with shame. This was my life now. This was what betrayal and systematic destruction looked like. A motel room that smelled like smoke and disappointment. Meals that cost less than $2. The crushing awareness that no one was coming to save me because everyone who might have cared had already decided I wasn't worth the trouble. I'd been living in room 14 for 3 weeks when I noticed the suitcase under the bed. I only found it because I dropped my phone charger and it rolled underneath. I got down on my hands and knees to reach for it, my fingers brushing against something solid, something that didn't belong there. I pulled it out into the light, an old suitcase made of worn brown leather with brass corners tarnished to green. It looked like something from another era, the kind of luggage people used before everything turned plastic and disposable. A luggage tag was tied to the handle with twine. When I turned it over and read the name written there, my hands began to shake. Megan Lawson. My full name, written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. The precise, careful script of my Aunt Margaret. I sat on the floor holding the suitcase trying to understand how it had gotten there. Margaret had died 9 months earlier. I'd gone to her funeral, stood at the graveside, watched them lower her casket into the ground. She'd lived alone for decades, dying alone in her house surrounded by filing cabinets and stacks of old newspapers. Everyone said it was sad but not surprising, considering how she had isolated herself with conspiracy theories and paranoid warnings about trusting the wrong people. So how had her suitcase ended up under the bed in a motel room I'd only been living in for 3 weeks? Had she somehow known I'd end up here? Had she left it with Rita at the front desk, asking her to place it in whatever room I rented? The logistics made no sense, but the proof was right in front of me. My name written in Aunt Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. The suitcase was locked with 2 brass latches that had small keyholes. I turned it over, checking every side, and found a small plastic bag taped underneath. Inside was a key. Aunt Margaret had always been paranoid, but her paranoia was practical in its own strange way. She hid things in plain sight, left clues that required patience, trusted that the right person would find them. I peeled off the tape, removed the key, and unlocked the suitcase with trembling hands. Inside was cash, $100,000 bundled with rubber bands, mostly $100 bills with a few 50s mixed in. The money smelled faintly of mothballs and old paper, like it had been stored somewhere for years. Beneath the stacks was a plain ticket printed on paper that had begun to yellow at the edges. Portland, Oregon. Departure date 4 days from now. Underneath the ticket was a note, written on yellow legal paper in Aunt Margaret's distinct script. Megan, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust Eric. Don't trust Amber. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. The truth is important. Use it wisely. I read those words 3 times, each time feeling both more shocked and more certain they were true. Don't trust Eric. Don't trust Amber. They'd been plotting this before my wedding. My mother, Evelyn, had died 6 years earlier in what everyone said was a car accident, late at night on a rainy road. Her car had wrapped around a tree on a route she'd driven hundreds of times. The police report said she was speeding, that she might have fallen asleep at the wheel. A tragedy, yes, but nothing suspicious. Aunt Margaret had insisted otherwise. She had cornered me at the funeral, pulled me aside, and whispered that my mother had been investigating financial fraud at the pharmaceutical company where she worked. That her death was too convenient. That the timing didn't make sense. That I needed to be careful about who I trusted. I dismissed it as grief twisting into paranoia. Aunt Margaret was always seeing conspiracies, always warning about corruption, always handing out pamphlets about things no one else believed were real. We'd all learned to smile politely and change the subject. But now I was sitting on the floor of a motel room, staring at $100,000 in cash and a note that proved she had been right all along. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in room 14 staring at the suitcase, the money, and the letter. By morning I'd made my choice. I wasn't going to run. I was done being the person life happened to. I was finished disappearing while the people who had destroyed my life walked away untouched. I packed my duffel bag with the few things that mattered. Some clothes, my laptop, and the cash sealed inside a waterproof bag. I left a note for Rita at the front desk saying I'd paid through the week but wouldn't be coming back. She looked at me with an expression that might have been concern or maybe relief that her problem tenant was finally leaving. "Good luck," she said in a tone that could have meant anything. The flight to Portland left early on a Thursday morning from a regional airport 40 minutes away. I booked the ticket using Aunt Margaret's money and spent the drive trying not to think about what I was really doing. Flying across the country to follow instructions from a dead aunt everyone had called paranoid. Chasing a conspiracy theory that somehow connected my husband's affair to my mother's death 6 years earlier. Believing that the deliberate destruction of my life was part of something much bigger, and far more calculated, than simple betrayal. When I said it out loud it sounded insane. But Aunt Margaret's note was tucked safely in my bag, the money was real, and the plane ticket had my name printed clearly on it. Crazy or not, I was going. The airline was one of those budget carriers that charges extra for absolutely everything, including, it seemed, the right to breathe. That's how it felt when they made me pay $15 just to bring a duffel bag that weighed less than most toddlers. I paid without arguing. I didn't have the energy. Then I spent 3 hours wedged between a businessman in an expensive suit who claimed both armrests as if he'd purchased them, and a college kid who watched videos on his phone without headphones like some kind of sociopath. I didn't sleep. The seats felt like they'd been designed by someone who hated human beings. But that wasn't the real reason I stayed awake. My mind wouldn't stop racing through questions that had no answers. What had my mother uncovered that made her dangerous enough to kill? How deep had Eric and Amber's involvement gone? Had any part of my marriage been real, or had it all been a performance from the start? Were there genuine moments hidden among the lies, or had every kiss, every "I love you," every touch been part of a long, calculated manipulation? The businessman beside me kept glancing at the duffel bag I clutched in my lap, probably wondering why I wouldn't just put it in the overhead bin like everyone else. I wanted to tell him it contained $100,000, and maybe the key to understanding how my life had been so carefully dismantled, but I just stared out the window instead. Below, the darkness was dotted with distant lights. Cities full of people whose lives still made sense in ways mine no longer did. Portland greeted me with gray skies and rain that felt different from back home. Colder, heavier, the kind that seeps through your clothes and settles deep in your bones. I rented a car with some of Aunt Margaret's cash and a nearly maxed-out credit card I'd been avoiding. The rental agent barely looked at me, processing the paperwork with the speed of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and stopped caring after the first 50. The address Aunt Margaret had written down led me out of the city toward Lake Oswego, a quiet suburb that spoke of money, privacy, and neighbors who minded their own business. The GPS guided me through tree-lined streets and past houses set far back from the road, each surrounded by wide lawns that separated one family's world from the next. Aunt Margaret's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small ranch-style home that looked like it had been built in the 70s and hadn't been updated since. The windows were dark. The lawn was overgrown, grass reaching the height that told you no one had mowed it in months. Cracks split the driveway, weeds pushing through like nature was reclaiming the property. It was the kind of house that silently announced, "Someone died here and nobody's figured out what to do with it yet." I parked in the driveway and sat in the rental car for a full minute, engine running, trying to decide if I was actually brave enough to go through with it. Aunt Margaret's note had given me an address and told me that the truth waited here. But what if the truth was worse than the lies? What if whatever I found inside made everything even more confusing instead of offering the clarity I craved? I turned off the engine before I could lose my nerve and stepped out into the cold drizzle. The front door was locked, but Aunt Margaret had left a second key taped inside a small envelope labeled "House" in the suitcase. I used it and let myself in. The air smelled stale and still, the smell of a place that hadn't been lived in for months, where no one had opened a window, cooked a meal, or spoken a word. The inside was exactly what my family had described when they talked about Aunt Margaret's eccentric lifestyle. Books everywhere, on shelves, stacked on tables, lined up along the baseboards. Filing cabinets stood where most people would have kept a couch. Boxes filled with papers were neatly labeled in Aunt Margaret's careful handwriting. The kitchen looked barely used. A coffee maker, a microwave, and a sink full of dishes that no one had washed before she died. But the note hadn't told me to look inside the house. It had pointed me to the shed behind it. I walked through to the back door and stepped into an overgrown yard, where grass and weeds had swallowed what might once have been a garden. The shed sat in the far corner, maybe 10 by 12 feet, and the locks on its door were newer and sturdier than anything else on the property. That detail stood out immediately. Everything else looked old and neglected, but those locks were recent, industrial grade, the kind used when you're protecting something valuable. I used the third key Aunt Margaret had left, the one labeled "Shed." The lock turned smoothly, almost too smoothly, like someone had oiled it recently. Inside, the shed was organized in a way that made the house look chaotic by comparison. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years ranging from the 1980s to the previous year. Boxes were stacked neatly along another wall, indexed with the precision of a professional archive. In the back corner, half hidden under a tarp and a few paint cans, was a trapdoor set into the floor. I pushed the paint cans aside and pulled back the tarp. The trapdoor had a handle and a lock. When I tried the fourth key Aunt Margaret had included, it fit perfectly. The lock clicked open, revealing a ladder that disappeared into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed down. What I found wasn't a crawl space. It was a climate-controlled evidence room. The space was about 7 feet tall and 15 feet wide, illuminated by battery-powered LED strips that flickered to life as I reached the bottom. The air was cool and dry, kept that way by a small dehumidifier humming quietly in the corner. Filing cabinets, more boxes, a table with a laptop, and even an old cassette player filled the room. Photos and documents were laid out in clear plastic sleeves, carefully arranged like evidence in an ongoing case. Aunt Margaret had spent years building this, a hidden archive preserving something she believed mattered, even when everyone else dismissed her as paranoid. I started with the photographs on the table because they were right in front of me, perfectly aligned like exhibits in a courtroom. The first one I picked up made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped it. It was a picture of my mother, Evelyn, standing between Eric and Amber at what was obviously a conference. All three wore name tags and business casual clothes, smiling at the camera like familiar colleagues. Behind them was a banner reading Everest Biotech Annual Research Summit. The date printed on the bottom corner said it all. 8 years ago. 8 years. 2 full years before I was supposed to have met Eric by chance at a dinner party. 2 years before our relationship had even started. I stared at that photograph, my mind desperately trying to create any explanation that could preserve part of the story I had believed about my life. Maybe they had met briefly at a work event and forgotten. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the photo was mislabeled. But deep down I already knew. This wasn't coincidence. Eric hadn't met me by accident. He had been positioned in my life. Chosen deliberately, cultivated as a relationship by people who needed access to my mother and saw me as the easiest way in. I had been a target before I was ever a girlfriend, a mark before I was a wife. And every moment of intimacy, every promise, every expression of love had been performance. A carefully rehearsed act in a story I didn't even know I was part of. My hands still shaking, I set the photograph down and reached for the cassette player. The cassette player was old. One of those heavy, portable models from the 1980s with built-in speakers and a handle that folded down. Next to it sat a small stack of cassette tapes, each one labeled in Aunt Margaret's neat handwriting with dates, names and short summaries. I picked up the first one on the pile and the label read, Eric Lawson and Richard Cole. March 2019. Discussion of Evelyn Lawson investigation status. Seeing my mother's name written in Aunt Margaret's unmistakable handwriting made my chest tighten. I slid the cassette into the player, pressed play, and after a burst of static, 2 voices filled the silence. Voices that made my hands go ice cold. The first was Eric's. I had heard that voice every day for 7 years. Heard it tell me that he loved me, that we had a future, that we were partners. Now I was hearing that same voice talk about my mother as if she were a problem to be solved. An obstacle to be removed. Evelyn's getting too close, Eric said. His tone was flat, businesslike, stripped of any emotion. She's made copies of the trial data, and she's been meeting with someone at the Food and Drug Administration. I don't know who yet, but I'm working on finding out through Megan. The second voice that answered him was older, deeper, more controlled. Richard Cole. We can't let this go public, he said. The approvals we've pushed through are worth billions. If she exposes the data manipulation, we're not just looking at financial losses, we're looking at criminal charges and the end of everything we've built. Can you contain her through the daughter? I've tried, Eric replied. But Evelyn doesn't share work details with Megan. She's protective. She thinks she's keeping her daughter safe by keeping her out of this. It's making my job harder. Megan doesn't know anything useful. Then we might need other options, Richard said after a long pause, his voice calm in a way that made my stomach turn. More permanent ones. We can't risk the entire operation because one accountant decided to grow a conscience. I hit pause. I couldn't breathe. They were calmly discussing killing my mother, turning her life into a line item on a list of contingencies. Eric, the man I had trusted, the man I had married, was part of that conversation. He had used me to get close to what my mother knew. And when that didn't work, he had agreed to help plan her death. I forced myself to press play again. There are ways to make it look accidental, Richard continued. We have people who specialize in this kind of cleanup. Car accidents happen all the time, especially on rainy nights on dangerous roads. Nobody questions those. What about afterward? Eric asked. If Evelyn dies, Megan's going to be devastated. She'll lean on me, which gives me more access to her life. But there's also that Aunt Margaret. She's paranoid. If Evelyn dies, she'll start asking questions. Let her ask, Richard said, dismissive and cold. Nobody takes Aunt Margaret Lawson seriously. She's been screaming about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Evelyn's death wasn't an accident, everyone will just roll their eyes. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. We clean up thoroughly, make sure the investigation's handled by people we trust, and we move on. The recording kept playing for another 20 minutes, full of details, lists, plans, names, all spoken in calm, even tones, as if they were planning a work trip rather than a murder. When the tape finally stopped, I sat in silence in the underground room, my whole body shaking. Eric hadn't just betrayed me, he had been planted in my life from the beginning. He had been part of a long, calculated plan to monitor my mother's investigation into Everest Biotech Corporation. He had dated me, proposed to me, married me, all as part of a strategy to gain access to information that might expose a multi-billion-dollar fraud. And when that failed, they killed her and made it look like an accident. I found more tapes, one labeled Amber Lewis and Dr. Linda Park. When I played it, I realized Amber, my best friend, the person I'd trusted the most, had been assigned to me after my mother's death. Her job was to keep me isolated, compliant, and under control, to make sure I never started questioning anything. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every conversation had been data collection. Every smile had been manipulation. Our entire friendship had been fabricated. I don't know how long I sat there listening, reading, connecting pieces of my life I had never thought to question. Hours maybe. Long enough for my back to ache from sitting on the cold floor, and my eyes to burn from staring under the harsh white light of the LED strips. Eventually, I found the laptop Aunt Margaret had left behind. It was plugged into a power strip, the battery light glowing green. A small note was taped to the screen. Play this first, it said, with an arrow pointing to a single video file on the desktop titled For Megan. I double-clicked the file and Aunt Margaret's face appeared on the screen. She looked exactly as I remembered her from the last family holiday 2 years ago. Only thinner, paler, weaker. Her face was drawn, her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the camera, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She was wearing her navy blue cardigan with the wooden buttons, the same one she'd worn to every holiday dinner for years. Megan, she began, her voice steady, though her breathing sounded labored. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone and you've found my archive. That also means you're angry, confused, and probably wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was still alive. She paused and took a sip of water from a bottle just off camera. The answer is that I tried. I warned you about Eric at your engagement party. I pulled you aside and told you to be careful, that something about him felt wrong. I told you to watch how Amber acted around him, to pay attention to the little things that didn't make sense. But you thought I was being paranoid. You told me I saw conspiracies everywhere and that I needed to let you live your own life. Aunt Margaret's expression softened. I don't blame you for that. I spent decades being the relative everyone described as difficult and eccentric. The one who handed out pamphlets about corporate corruption at Thanksgiving, the one who warned against trusting people with perfect smiles and easy answers. By the time I tried to warn you about Eric, you'd already learned to tune me out. She adjusted the camera angle, leaning closer. Your mother, Evelyn, was my sister, and my best friend long before she was your mother. We grew up protecting each other. When she discovered what Everest was doing, she came to me first because she knew I'd help her document everything properly. We spent months gathering evidence, preparing to go to the federal authorities. Then she died in that convenient accident, and I knew what had really happened even though I couldn't prove it yet. Margaret coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. When she lowered it, there was blood on the white fabric. I've spent the last 6 years collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. Every document, every recording, every traceable financial trail. I did it because I loved your mother. And because I love you. Because I couldn't let them get away with killing Evelyn and destroying your life without any consequences. She took a slow breath, then looked straight into the camera. You have two choices, Megan. Just like your mother did before they killed her. You can take the money I left you and disappear. Change your name. Move somewhere far away. Live quietly, comfortably, and safely. Never look back. No one would blame you for choosing survival over justice. You've already lost so much. You deserve peace if that is what you want, Aunt Margaret said, coughing again, harder this time, and had to stop for a long moment before she could keep going. Or you can fight. Use everything I have gathered to take these people down. Expose Everest. Expose Eric and Amber and every person who helped cause your mother's death and tear your life apart. It will not be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You will be threatened. You will be harassed. You may be in danger. But Megan, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you do not win all the way, you will still make them pay for what they did. She smiled then, that crooked smile I remembered from when I was little, when she would sneak me extra cookies or let me stay up past bedtime reading in her library. Either way, you will have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you no matter what path you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night. Aunt Margaret's expression turned serious again. I love you, Megan. Do not let them win. She reached for something off camera, then looked back toward the screen. Oh, and there is one last thing I did not include in the written files. Summit National Bank, account number 7743. The password is your mother's employee number from Everest. That is the real fortune. The $100,000 in the suitcase is only travel money. Use what is in that account to fight or use it to disappear, but for God's sake, use it. The video ended with Aunt Margaret reaching for the camera, and then the screen went black. I sat there staring at the dead screen for a long time before I finally pulled out my phone and looked up the number for Summit National Bank. Calling Summit National Bank took 45 minutes of bouncing through automated menus before I finally reached an actual person. I gave her the account number Aunt Margaret had given me, and the woman on the other end went quiet for so long that I thought the call had dropped. "Ma'am," she said finally, and now her voice sounded a lot more formal. "I am going to have to transfer you to our wealth management division. Please hold." The hold music was classical piano that sounded like it was being played underwater. After what felt like forever, a woman who introduced herself as Patricia came on the line and asked me to confirm my identity using my mother's employee number as the password. When I gave her the numbers, she paused and then explained in slow, careful wording that Aunt Margaret had created a trust in my name. The trust contains stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights that your mother secured before her death, Patricia said. The total value is approximately $15 million. It is structured to protect the assets from legal disputes and to make sure that only you can access them. $15 million. The words did not even sound real to me. They sounded like lines from a movie about someone else's life, not mine. I was sitting in a dead woman's hidden evidence room, surrounded by proof of conspiracy and murder, and being told I had access to more money than I had ever imagined having. Aunt Margaret had not only spent 6 years gathering proof. She had also spent those 6 years building a financial base that would let me fight without being destroyed by legal costs and endless court battles. She had wrapped justice like a gift and left it with the tools to use it. I chose to fight. Using the contact information Aunt Margaret left in her files, I called Agent Lauren Hayes at the FBI's Seattle field office. She answered on the third ring with a tone that made it sound like she was busy and did not have time for anything unnecessary. "Hey," she said. "My name is Megan Lawson," I said, and I could hear that my voice was shaking a little. "My Aunt Margaret Lawson left me information about a case I think you have been trying to build about Everest Biotech Corporation." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I pulled the phone away to check if the call had cut off. Then Agent Hayes spoke again, and her voice sounded completely different. "Where are you right now?" "At my aunt's property near Lakewood," I said. "Do not leave," she said. "I am on my way to you. Do not talk to anyone else about this. Do not touch anything else. And whatever Margaret left you, do not move it. I will be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before I could answer. Agent Hayes showed up in 35 minutes, which told me she had driven faster than the speed limit. She looked to be in her late 40s, with dark hair streaked with gray pulled back in a practical ponytail. She was wearing jeans and a blazer, and an FBI badge was clipped to her belt. She looked at me, standing in Aunt Margaret's overgrown backyard, with a mix of doubt and something that looked almost like hope. "Show me," she said. I brought her to the shed, then down the ladder into the underground archive, and I watched her face change as she took in the filing cabinets, the boxes, and the way 6 years of work had been organized and labeled. She put on latex gloves before she touched a single page, pulling files, reading them with a level of focus that made it very clear why Aunt Margaret had trusted her in the first place. After about 20 minutes of going through documents, Agent Hayes looked at me. "Your aunt was either the most thorough investigator I have ever seen or she was completely brilliant," she said. "Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We are talking conspiracy charges, fraud, possibly murder if we can show the car crash was arranged. Megan, you just handed me a case that could bring down a major pharmaceutical company." The investigation that came after that moved forward with a slow, grinding kind of speed that Agent Hayes told me was normal when you are building a case against a corporation with billions in assets and whole teams of lawyers. Subpoenas had to be written, checked, and signed by judges. Bank accounts had to be frozen, which meant warrants, which meant probable cause, which meant more paperwork than I knew existed. Former Everest employees who had been fired or pressured out under suspicious circumstances were interviewed. The quiet network of people in the pharmaceutical world who had tried to speak up before and gotten burned started to come forward and tell their own stories about fraud and retaliation. Agent Hayes helped me find a small apartment in Denver, a one-bedroom in an older building with wood floors that creaked and windows that rattled whenever trains passed on the tracks 2 blocks away. It was already better than room 14 at the Silver Star Motel, but I still kept things modest because I did not want to act like the money existed for comfort. The money existed for the fight. I used money from Aunt Margaret's trust to pay rent and groceries and lived simply while the investigation moved forward around me. I met with prosecutors every few weeks. They wanted specific details about every single piece of evidence Aunt Margaret had saved. They asked me to walk them through timelines, through connections, through conversations I had heard years ago but hadn't realized were important at the time. They wanted to know about Eric's schedule, about Amber coming over, about how my mother had been behaving in the months before she died. I answered every question as completely as I could. I watched them scribble notes and look at each other in a way that told me they were putting a structure together. Agent Hayes would call me with updates from time to time, and most of what she said was some version of, "We are making progress and do not discuss this with anyone." It was the kind of thing federal agents say when they cannot tell you details, but they want you to know you are not being ignored. Waiting was harder than anything else I'd been through. I had handed over everything Aunt Margaret had gathered, and now I was just sitting inside a holding pattern, hoping that for once the system would protect the person who had been hurt instead of protecting the people who had caused the damage. For months after I first met Agent Hayes in Aunt Margaret's underground archive, events started moving with a kind of speed that made it clear the government had finally reached a point where it felt confident taking action. It began on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Everest Biotech Corporation headquarters got raided by federal agents who walked out carrying boxes from a glass building that looked like a monument to corporate success. The images made national news, showing employees standing in the parking lot looking confused and scared while agents in FBI jackets moved with calm efficiency through a building that everyone had believed was untouchable. Richard Cole, the chief executive whose voice I had heard on Aunt Margaret's tapes talking about my mother's death like it was nothing more than an obstacle, was arrested at his home. News crews filmed him being let out in handcuffs past his neighbors, past reporters who shouted questions he did not answer, past a life that had been built on fraud and was now collapsing in real time. Agent Hayes called me that afternoon to tell me that Eric had been arrested at his office at a tech startup where he had been working since the divorce. I watched that footage on the local news that evening and rewound it several times, because apparently I had developed unhealthy coping habits built around watching karma show up wearing handcuffs. Eric kept his posture. He did not yell, did not try to run, did not say a word to the cameras. He walked with his head high like this was just an inconvenience rather than an arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. But in his eyes I could see something I had never seen in him before. Fear. And something else too. He truly looked like he had believed he could never be touched, and he was only now understanding how wrong he had been. Amber was arrested 2 days later at a coffee shop in Phoenix, where she had apparently moved after the divorce. She had used her Everest money to build a graphic design business that, according to reports, was actually legitimate this time. The news said she cried when they took her out in cuffs. I'm sure the tears played well on camera. They did not play well for me. This was the same woman who had sat in divorce court and given calm, confident lies about me without showing even a flicker of guilt. Her attorney put out a statement saying that Amber had been misled by Eric, that she had never known the full scope of the conspiracy, that she was also a victim and had been taken advantage of by more powerful people. But I had heard the tapes of Amber talking to Dr. Linda Park. I had read the documents that showed direct payments made to her for the specific purpose of maintaining access to me, keeping me isolated, and keeping me under control after my mother's death. Amber had not been some confused bystander. She had been assigned to me. She had performed the role she was paid to perform. Every Thursday night with wine had been surveillance. Every conversation where she told me to trust Eric, to stop overthinking, to believe that marriage problems were normal and temporary, had been scripted manipulation. In certain ways, Amber's betrayal cut deeper than Eric's. I chose to marry Eric. I did not choose Amber. She was placed in my life. Our entire friendship had been staged from the very beginning. Then came the news about Judge Thomas Whitmore. He resigned from the bench and released a statement saying he wanted to spend more time with his family, which is what corrupt officials always claim when they are hoping that walking away will keep them from being criminally charged. It did not work. He was indicted 3 weeks later for taking bribes and steering decisions in court. Files Aunt Margaret had saved showed that he had purchased a vacation home through a trust that was funded by Everest, and that for years he had ruled in favor of corporate interests in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. Every case he had ruled on in the last 10 years was pulled for review. My divorce case was one of the first. A new judge needed only 15 minutes to decide that the original ruling was based on false testimony and a process so biased it could not stand. Everything Whitmore had ordered in my divorce was thrown out, erased as if it had never existed. Agent Hayes called me the day my case was reviewed. Your marriage to Eric is being annulled instead of finalized as a divorce, she said. The court is declaring it invalid from the start because of fraud. You are also receiving a formal apology from the court system, for whatever that is worth. It was worth something. Not everything, not nearly everything, but something. The formal apology from the court system came as an actual letter on official court stationery, signed by 3 judges, including the one who reviewed my case. The letter stated that I had been placed into proceedings that were structurally compromised by corruption and fabricated testimony. It said the court regretted that I had been harmed by a process that failed to protect me from organized fraud. It was 2 pages of extremely careful legal language, the kind of language that tries to show remorse without admitting direct liability in a way that could invite lawsuits. I read it once. Then I filed it in the same box as every other document that marked the collapse of my old life and the slow work of building a new one. The apology did not undo the nights I spent on couches and in motel rooms. It did not erase what it felt like to watch my supposed best friend testify against me without a blink. It did not take away the humiliation of losing everything because a judge had already been bought long before I ever set foot in the courtroom. But it was acknowledgement. It was an official record that said, what happened to you was wrong. The trials began 6 months after the arrests and stretched out over a year and a half. Agent Hayes had warned me early on that cases like this moved slowly, that building prosecutions against multiple defendants tied together through overlapping financial crimes and violent crimes required patience and absolute precision. He was right. The legal process moved forward with a kind of slow, crushing, administrative force that made glaciers look fast. Richard Cole went to trial first. His trial turned into a media spectacle that took over the news for weeks. Whistleblowers from the pharmaceutical world testified, describing how fraud operated inside Everest, explaining how executives pressured researchers to manipulate clinical trial results, and how safety concerns were buried if they threatened approval timelines for profitable drugs. Patients who had been hurt by medications that never should have made it to the market told their stories. One woman spoke for 20 minutes about watching her daughter die from complications tied to a drug Everest had pushed through approval using falsified safety data. Forensic accountants testified and mapped the flow of money, showing how executive bonuses were directly tied to fraudulent approvals, and how Richard Cole personally profited every single time a dangerous medication was pushed into the world. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they came back, they read guilty verdicts on 17 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and reckless endangerment. Richard Cole did not react. He stood there while the judge read the sentence: 23 years in federal prison and forfeiture of approximately $50 million in assets. He was 62 years old. That meant he would most likely spend the rest of his life in prison. I watched that sentencing in person, sitting in the last row of the gallery so I could see everything without being seen. When the judge finished and the deputies led Richard Cole out in handcuffs, I felt something that was not quite relief and not quite revenge. It felt like watching an extremely long math problem finally resolve. All the variables that had been twisted and hidden for years were forced into their correct positions and locked there. Eric's trial was smaller and quieter. It did not draw the cameras and headlines that had followed Richard Cole, but it mattered to me in a way nothing else did. I went to court every day. I sat in the same seat in the same back row and watched as the prosecutors laid it all out. His role in tracking my mother, his role in planning her death, his marriage to me as a 7-year intelligence-gathering operation. The tapes Aunt Margaret had saved were played for the jury. I sat there and listened to Eric talk about my mother as if she were an obstacle to be removed. I heard him describe conversations he had with me about her work. I heard him outline strategies for using our relationship to pull information from me. The prosecutors brought in bank records that showed the steady payments he had received for the entire length of our marriage. They showed that he had been paid to stay married to me, paid to keep collecting, paid to keep lying. His defense attorney tried to argue that Eric was a minor player, that he had been pushed and manipulated by people with more power, that he had not fully understood what he was part of. The recordings did not show someone who had been confused or dragged along. The tapes showed someone eager and willing. They captured Eric making strategic suggestions about how to handle killing my mother. They showed that he kept accepting payments and stayed involved in the conspiracy for years after her death. The jury found him guilty on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Eric looked at me from across the courtroom. His face was a mix of anger and something like resignation, like he could not quite process that the woman he had married for the purpose of surveillance was the same woman who had brought in the evidence that destroyed him. I met his eyes without blinking and without emotion. I was finished letting people who had underestimated me make me feel small. Amber did not go to trial. She took a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against the others, her sentence was cut to 8 years. She gave information about Dr. Linda Park and other Everest employees who were part of the conspiracy. She helped prosecutors build cases against people who might have slipped away otherwise. 6 months after she was sentenced, I got a letter from her. 3 pages on prison stationery. It was full of apologies and explanations about how she had been young and broke when Everest first approached her. She wrote that she had made terrible decisions she regretted every single day. She wrote that being assigned to get close to me had started as a job, but that it got complicated because she said she really did care about me later, even though the friendship had been built on lies. She asked if one day we could forgive each other and move forward, because what we had was real, even if it began as manipulation. I read the letter one time sitting in my apartment in Denver with my first cup of coffee. All I felt was a flat kind of satisfaction. The letter was self-defense written in the language of regret. It was an attempt to rewrite the story so that Amber could see herself as a victim of circumstance instead of an active part of the machine that tore my life apart. She wanted absolution. I was not going to give it. I put the letter in a folder with everything else that documented betrayal, and I never answered her. Some relationships cannot be repaired. Some should not even be attempted. Forgiveness is not something you owe to the people who helped destroy your life just because, later, they do not like how it feels to sit with what they did. The civil suit against Everest Biotech Corporation dragged on for 2 full years. The company fought like its life depended on it. They sent in teams of lawyers whose only job was to slow everything down, question every claim, and stretch the process for as long as possible. But in the end, with criminal convictions already on record for their leadership, they settled. The terms of the settlement required Everest to pay $3 billion to patients who had been harmed by the fraudulent drug approvals. They were forced to fund independent safety reviews of every medication they had pushed to market in the last 10 years. They were placed under federal monitoring for 15 years, with regulators built directly into their approval pipeline so they could not bury safety problems again. My mother's estate was awarded $13 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it because I am her only surviving family. I did not keep any of it. I donated the full amount to organizations that fight for drug safety and corporate transparency. The money felt poisoned. It had been bought with my mother's death. And I already had enough to live on because of what Aunt Margaret left me. Instead, I took part of the money from Aunt Margaret's trust and built the Lawson Foundation for Truth and Justice. It is a non-profit focused on investigating fraud in the pharmaceutical industry and protecting whistleblowers who are punished for telling the truth. We hired investigators to track down evidence of safety violations. We paid legal costs for employees who were attacked for reporting wrongdoing. We released reports that made executives furious. We dragged their secrets into daylight. The foundation became my full-time work. It became the place where I put my anger and my grief, and the part of me that refuses to let what happened to my mother and to Aunt Margaret turn into just another tragedy people forget. It became proof that what was taken from me could still become something that protects other people. It became something I know they both would have been proud of. I still think about room 14 at the Silver Star Motel. I think about sitting on that collapsed mattress, eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, trying to convince myself that I would ever dig out of the hole my life had become. I keep the receipt from my last paid week there in my wallet. I keep it to remind myself that rock bottom is not poetic. It is not dramatic. It is ugly and humiliating, and it smells like old cigarette smoke. And still it is survivable. You do not die just because people want you broken. Aunt Margaret understood that. She spent the last years of her life not hiding but building. She gathered proof. She built structure. She stockpiled resources. She did it because she believed that truth matters more than comfort and that justice matters more than safety. He was right. The paranoid aunt everybody mocked was the only one who understood how the world actually works. She knew something I had to learn the hard way. Powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you're polite and follow the rules. Especially rules they never follow themselves. The last truth she left me has turned out to be more accurate than I wanted it to be. Fighting doesn't always mean you win. But refusing to fight guarantees you will lose. I rebuilt an honest life from the ruins of a false one. It is still messy. It is still complicated. But it is real. It is mine. It is a life my mother and Aunt Margaret would actually recognize and approve of. It is a life that proves something simple that people forget. Patience and proof can bring down empires built on lies. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is refusing to let corrupt people erase you from the story just because it is more convenient for them if you disappear. I am not the woman I was when I pulled that old suitcase out from under the motel bed. I am stronger than she was. I am more careful with trust. And I am more sure about what matters. That version of me did not understand how much she could survive. She did not understand how much power she already had once everything fake was stripped away. I am glad I am not her anymore. If this story of truth and survival held you all the way to the end, show your support by hitting like right now. My favorite part was when Megan found Aunt Margaret's underground archive and realized that the aunt everyone called paranoid had been right about everything from the start. What was the moment that hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments. Do not miss more stories like this. Stories about truth and consequences and people who refuse to disappear. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you know the second we upload the next one.